Thanks everybody for coming tonight. I'm Kyle Kondik, Managing Editor of the Crystal Ball and Communications Director for the Center for Politics. So thanks for coming. Thanks for watching online if you are. I'm going to introduce our great panel real quick here, and then we'll just jump right into it. To my left is Olivia Beavers. She's a congressional reporter with the Wall Street Journal, was also at Politico. I'd say a rising star in political journalism, so thanks for being here. Miles Coleman, my partner in crime at the associate editor of the Crystal Ball. I gave him the best gift any political analyst could want earlier today, the new copy of the 2026 Almanac of American Politics. A gift from the center, really, but anyway, that's Miles will devour that. So, Sophia Nelson, she's a columnist with Forbes and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and also founder and CEO of the Redefining Freedom Center of Virginia. Thanks for joining us. John Latt, Democratic political consultant, one-time executive director of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee for the 2006 cycle, kind of famous election cycle where Democrats won the House in George W. Bush's second midterm. And then Mark Short, who is most importantly, a Center for Politics scholar, but was the chief of staff for Vice President Mike Pence and has been very involved in Republican politics over the years. So thanks to everyone for joining us.
I don't think I've ever been introduced as a scholar, so that's
So let me just, I guess sort of the first thing I wanted to ask about was we're in the midst of this government shutdown. I don't necessarily know how big of a deal it is. I'm curious as to what you all think about it. But Olivia, you're reporting on the Hill. Is there any end in sight here? Like, what do you think about what the end game here might be?
It's tough to say right now, but I feel like it's a Groundhog Day where we're going in. Speaker Johnson's doing press conferences. They're saying almost the same thing. Jeffries is having a rebuttal. Today when I was driving down, it actually looked like it got a little bit more testy between them. There were some confrontations, and you might have seen videos of that. I imagine that starts picking up because, well, one, lawmakers just saw that they can get attention if they are showing up at the Capitol and doing these confrontations, but also I think the pressure is starting to build. It's felt really sleepy. So it's kind of been surprising that there has not really seemed like a lot of pressure to fix the shutdown, and when usually there is, you're in the Capitol building till 10, 11, 12 o'clock because they're having all these rushed meetings. At 6 o'clock, I'm watching leadership staff walk out. That is a sign that there is not a ton of pressure and both sides are dug in. So maybe by October 15th, when troops aren't paid, and you start seeing more and more stories of people who can't get into the airports and can't get home and start calling their representatives and saying, the government's not working for us, that's when you might start seeing some changes actually taking place.
Miles, public opinion on this is like pretty mixed, right?
Yeah, for now, I mean, it seems like more people, if you look at the preponderance of what polls say, most people tend to blame the Republicans a bit more, but, that is, you might have some special implications in the race we're in right now for the here in Virginia. But I do wonder if it kind of drags on more, if both sides start to get blamed more like the same, I guess.
Yeah, it's basically like, Democrats may be a little bit less blame than Republicans, but a lot of people are saying they blame both sides. So, what do you think about, the shutdown, and do you see it as being, an issue coming up in the election next year?
Well, someone who lives in Northern Virginia, where the shutdown is felt acutely, I think. You have a lot of the defense contractors, you have the government. I have neighbors and people that are furloughed and laid off. I think that the people aren't interested in this political scoreboard that we're talking about. They're looking at their lives. They can't afford groceries. They're worried about their health care. They're worried about the coming of winter and the holidays and kids in school and all the things that they feel tightening around them. And so I think it's going to be a huge issue. I think it's why Spanberger in Virginia has a +10 lead. And she's a very low-key candidate if you think about it. She's like no drama. It's just not exciting, it's not bad, it just is. And that's kind of refreshing in this environment. But I think that when we go into the midterms, it all depends on how this shakes out, whether or not this last another month, 2 months, it stops? Who gets the blame? I think it's too early to tell the impact on the midterms yet, but I think Virginia's it's gonna carry Spamberger, I think.
John and Mark, you guys have been through this before. You know, I guess I think of 2013 as being kind of the shutdown that really stands out in my mind, and yet, you know, Republicans were blamed for that, and then they still ended up having like a really awesome midterm in 2014. So I don't know, you know,
Yeah.
where do you guys see
So
this?
I think this is one of those off-season, preseason game kind of things. Like, there's not a lot else going on, so let's follow this. And look, people are affected by this, but in terms of the politics of it, this is something we talk about in the off year. I could see Republicans either passing a series of continuing resolutions all the way through, or Thune just taking the nuclear option and just going with it with 50. But at the end of it, I think the reason it matters, I don't think the shutdown matters electorally, but the reason it matters, when you're Republicans and you run all three branches of government, it shows a level of incompetence, that you were given power to run the government and you are not able to do it. Now look, the Democratic brand is not a super great one. There aren't a lot of people asking for Democratic hats and jerseys to wear around town. That's not a very popular team. But the problem is, when you're running everything and you're showing a level of incompetence, that has a way of getting back to you. If you look back to where George Bush was in 2006, the party in power is going to pay a price for incompetence and mismanagement.
In 2013, Democrats owned the White House and the Senate, and Republicans were blamed for the shutdown. I think that historically, that when one party votes to fund the government and one party votes against that, that's the party that gets blamed. But I think it's upside down right now. I think that for a lot of Americans, to your first question, I think they've kind of gotten used to this. And so it doesn't have as much of an impact. And I think by the time we get to November 26th, there's going to be 400 other issues we're dealing with. And so I don't think it's have a big impact on the midterms. But I think that the responsibility for right now, I think voters are used to basically Republicans being the ones who have historically caused the shutdown. And so I think there's sort of a muscle memory there. There's a lot of drama around President Trump always. And I think that there's kind of just a sense of pox on both houses. Like, we're just so tired of the dysfunction of Congress. And so it's harder to draw conclusions of who's to blame. I do think it's different, because I've been part of the party that has shut down the government on many occasions, and I think you're responsible for it when you voted against government funding. And this time, it's the Democrats who voted against government funding, but who is responsible for a lot of Americans is certainly less clear today.
You know, go ahead.
Kyle, could I add something to Mark's point? We were talking in the off before we went live here that in Virginia, we're now in a race to the lowest common denominator of who sent the worst text, who wants to murder who said what.
Tough competition.
It's really bad. Like, when I was coming down, Winsome Sears just got busted for something in 2022. Then the lady who outed Jay Jones got busted for something as he got busted for something. And they're outing each other. And that's where we are. That's what they're talking about. To your point, Mark, people are just done. They're disgusted, I think.
You know, the Democrats could have effectively precipitated this shutdown back in March. And at the time, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer decided not to do that. His favorability got a lot worse with Democrats after he decided not to do that. You know, is this just an instance of, I think back to 2013, and sort of there were certain Republicans who kind of wanted to make sure that they looked tough, basically, and say that they were fighting. Is the same thing just happening to Democrats? And Olivia, what do you think about that?
Well, I think my colleagues and I were talking about this. I think we got into the situation in a few different ways. One was, as Mark was sort of alluding to, we're used to House Republicans shutting down the government. So I think that Senate Democrats were actually kind of caught surprised that the party, some of the Republicans who have never voted for a short-term CR, voted for them. And then I think Republicans are now being surprised that Senate Democrats are not folding for them, and they're demanding health care, which was, I think, the #2 issue in the last presidential election, and saying if you don't, the premiums are going to double, and they are trying to hammer that message in. So I think we're just sort of at an impasse, and we haven't really figured out how do they get out of it? Because right now, Republicans are largely deferring to President Trump, and he's not really having these communications with Democrats. But that's probably where it boils down to. Mike Johnson is not going to go negotiate with Chuck Schumer. He's going to wait for President Trump to give him a nod about whether he can say, yes, we're going to do something on the ACA subsidies, or no, we're not going to do that. But that's really what seems to be the holding pattern. And if you ask some of the more centrist Democrats, they thought that they needed to take a stand against President Trump. That's what Jared Golden, he's one of the most endangered Democrats in Maine, whose district swung more than almost 10 points towards President Trump in the last election. And he survived other races, but he said Democrats are being pushed by far left groups to take a stand against Trump. But if you ask some other Democrats, they say they don't need to be pushed to take a stand against Trump. They would do it anyway.
Anyone else have any other thoughts on this about, I don't know, the position of Democratic leadership? Again, to me, it was a more familiar story on the Republican side that, Republicans were facing all this pressure from essentially from their own voters, and now maybe you have a situation where Democrats are doing like that.
I think it's a sense where, Democrats are really dejected and depressed, but elections have consequences. So when they take over the presidency and everything else, and you have a president, quite frankly, who doesn't respect the rule of law. So even when they pass an agreement, he'll claw back the things that he does or doesn't like. So then the Democratic base will say, you guys are a bunch of patsies, you guys roll over. And to me, at that point, that is why, the reason you have to stay and fight is because you have somebody who isn't respecting it, and the only way they will is if the few levers of power that you have is not to support a budget is the only way to bring him to the table. So I think it is a level of a frustration foul. It's a level of listening to the base, but also the middle of the country that is frustrated with, at the same time, Trump has promised to bring down prices. He hasn't. Things are getting more expensive. So again, the ball is in their court. It's all about lower prices, and instead, it seems to be all about bickering and dysfunction instead.
I think one thing that's different is that traditionally, one of the base parts of the Democrat Party is government employees. And so they've been more reluctant to actually shut down the government and put them out of work or out of pay. And so this is an upside down world that we're kind of living in today. I do think that there have been occasions when Republicans have marched into shutdowns because you felt like your voters were upset. They were upset in 2013, feeling like after in the fifth year of Obama, that it was like, when are we actually going to stand up and do something? And I do think that that's what's happening. I think the Democrat base was saying, you need to go do something. But I think as well that, in an odd way, I think the longer this goes on, I actually think it advantages the Democrats. Yeah. Because there is a backstop here with the Obamacare subsidies. The Republican position has been, we'll do that at the end of the year. Well, the longer it drags on, the closer that clock goes. And I don't think it's a secret for anybody that President Trump's pollster has basically come to him and said, this is a losing issue for you. And so I think the president's going to lean on leadership to cave on this issue before too long. I think the Democrats were really shrewd when you guys were in diapers. When they passed Obamacare, one of the things the Democrats did is that they went to insurance companies to get them bought off to support Obamacare and said, we'll include subsidies in this. And so every few years, we keep increasing the subsidies. And we're at a point now that Republicans are reluctant to actually vote against that. And so I think you're going to continue to see Republicans cave on the issue. And I think the president is going to be one of the first ones who says, look, let's cut a deal on this.
It's an amazing illustration of the rhythms of political opinion in that the Democrats, they lost on the ACA in 2010 and 2014 and arguably 2016. Yeah. And now the Republicans are losing because they're trying to do away with it. I mean, it just shows sort of the rhythms.
But I disagree strongly. I think everybody on this panel, I love us, but I think we've been in Washington too long and we've been doing this too long. This moment is not like anyone we've ever seen. And until I think we all get a grip on that, these people don't like each other. The Democrats and the Republicans, when I worked on the Hill as an intern and I worked as a young attorney, they were collegial. They didn't always agree, but there was never this type of, did you see Pam Bondi yesterday testifying before the Senate? I worked in the Senate. You could never speak to a senator like that, particularly not as the Attorney General of the United States. My point is there's a visceral dislike and hatred of each other. They are polarized in a way that I do not think moves them towards the common sense things all of us are opining about. I think they want to see who burns who first. And I think that that's a level of where our politics has sunk to that I think is going to be really problematic for us as we go forward into our 250th year next year.
I agree with this. So the one other thing I'd say is one of the other reasons that Democrats are so angry and so mad at what they view as establishment leadership that rolls over and just lets it all happen is how this all started with Elon Musk, who basically went in, shut down USAID, then they shut down the Department of Education. So it's like, you didn't stop them then, you have to stop them now. Whatever you have, if it means lying in the street. That's why this is how we got here, is how it started, where they felt it just went on and on and on. So like, in their mind, and I think it's also a lot of independents too, to show some backbone is right now. And this happens to be the time for it, is the shutdown.
Yeah, kind of basically on that point. Back in March, I was invited to talk to a group of local Democrats in basically one of the counties around here. And before I got up to give them my kind of thoughts, I was just listening to just talk about basically politics, and this wasn't much after Trump took office, and the most unpopular person in the whole room, it was Chuck Schumer. It was not Trump, and I almost felt like Schumer, given that position, did he have a lot of options? He is really lucky his seat is not up next year, because I think otherwise he'd have a decent challenge from basically from AOC.
Anyone want to make any other points on the shutdown? If not, let me move on. So we talk about 2025 elections coming up. To me, and maybe there's some other suggestions from the panel, but odd-numbered years. Obviously, Virginia has elections basically every year, either at the federal or the state level. But there isn't a ton going on, but there are 5 elections in particular that I think are pretty important. You've got Virginia governor, and then the down ballot races as well in the House of Delegates. You got New Jersey governor. You've got this California redistricting ballot issue, in which Democrats are trying to essentially gerrymander California as a response to Republican gerrymandering efforts in other places. You've got kind of this esoteric election in Pennsylvania. There's a state Supreme Court. Retention elections, basically Democrats control the court, but if these 3 justices lose, no one will control the court. And then maybe the most famous candidate of this year was Zohran Mamdani, trying to win the mayor's race in New York City. My own sense of it, and Miles and I, we try to handicap these things, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But my sense of it is that the Democrats, or the Democratic aligned side, is probably favored in all 5 of these races. And first of all, I would just ask, maybe I'll start with Miles. Do you agree with that? And also, if there's a potential for an upset among those 5 races, which one do you think is the best candidate?
I mean, I would say, I would basically agree with your assessment that the Democrats should be favored in all of those. I mean, if you look at, just what the national environment is, if you just go by where Trump's approval rating is right now, I think it is it's not a great environment for the Republicans, but it's not a catastrophic one either. But I would say maybe, when you were saying maybe the most famous candidate of this year being Mamdani, I thought you were about to say in Virginia, our candidate for Attorney General here. Because that's been like
That's a down ballot race, but for Attorney General, if you didn't see the story, Jay Jones, Democratic candidate, had all these explosive text messages come out, which may provide a lifeline to.
That's kept us busy. That's like whole week, and the reporter who broke that story was actually a UVA graduate. We've been talking ever since then, and I was talking with her yesterday, and she was asking me about, can you believe all the scandals in Virginia this year? And I'm like, yeah, well, I'm originally from Louisiana, and even I'm impressed with, with all this stuff here. But yeah,
Of those races I mentioned, any that you're looking at maybe for upset potential, or again, maybe you disagree with my characterization. Yeah, go ahead.
New Jersey's the one, I think. And
that's a good one too.
I think Mikey Sherrill's got a lead, but I grew up in South Jersey, and that is a different place. It's like Alabama in the South, and it is New York in the North. So it's two different states within a state, and Trump is actually pretty liked there, believe it or not. He didn't win, but this Citarelli guy, is that what his name?
Yeah.
If there's going to be an upset, it's not going to happen here in Virginia, but it could happen in New Jersey.
And of course, Trump didn't win New Jersey, but he did do a lot better there than he had done in either 2020 or 2016. Other thoughts about this year's elections?
The thing, for New Jersey, and I think we've got a great candidate there. I think the issue is they should really look at the Terry McAuliffe race in Virginia, where they really tried to trump it up big time, and they laid all in on that. And I think there can be some Trump, but there has to be a particular thing about customizing to the state and the candidate and authentic. And so if you look at, so that's why I worry about it. I still think we're going to win there, but I think it'll be very close. In Virginia, the thing I think is so fascinating, we have a great candidate in Spanberger, but with Winsome, the weird thing is the quote that stands out and the ad that stands out is actually not, they don't have her dead to rights on the quote, they just have her dead to rights on being unhinged. The quote, "I am speaking," where she just looks like she's going to launch into somebody and have like a TNT vest and just go after it. I've never seen anything like it. I'm sure if they could take it back and do it over again to say, not only watch what you say, but how you say it. I mean, that ad, they must have put 10, 20,000 points behind just that one line in different iterations. But the reason I think it's a smarter campaign is they weave Trump into it, but it's always about cost. It's always about safety on top of bio for Spanberger, who's a different kind of Democrat. So I wish they did more. They have a great candidate in New Jersey, someone who served in the military. I wish they wove in more bio and made it more customized the way they do in Virginia.
Look, I think that the challenge for Republicans ever since Trump came onto the stage is that he brings out a certain voter that when he's not on the ballot doesn't turn out. And because he's as polarizing as he is, he then hurts Republicans when it's a midterm cycle or a 2017 or, today in 2025. And so I think you're talking about, in this year, a landscape that's basically in Democrat states. I don't think Virginia is actually a purple state anymore. I think it's a blue state. I think the reality is it needs a perfect storm for Republicans to win. And I think Joe Biden provided that for Glenn Youngkin. The last time Republicans won, Obama provided that for McDonnell. And so I wish it was different, but I think you're basically talking largely Democrat states that these are in. And I think Republicans have a hard time turning out the same turnout when Trump is not on the ballot. And so I think this favors Democrats significantly. I do think, however, that the Jay Jones texts aren't just explosive. I mean, calling for the political assassination of an opponent and the assassination of that opponent's family just goes so far beyond the pale that I think that I do think that Miara is likely to succeed in his reelection campaign in Virginia. But outside of that, I think it's going to be a Democrat year.
Can I add, though, what I think, and he's right, but do you guys remember a guy named Justin Fairfax? He was lieutenant governor, 2019. What I find fascinating, and I wrote about that quite a bit when it was happening, they threw him all the way under the bus really fast, Justin Fairfax, and it was really Northam was the focus, and they switched, remember, in Fairfax? With this,
It's possible if Fairfax hadn't had the problems, he would have been governor. 'Cause
right.
it was-
With this Jay Jones thing, the Democrats have pretty much stuck with him. They've rebuked him, but they've stuck with him, which I find, again, back to my earlier point about the polarization and how hateful they are towards each other, which is like, normally that would have killed a candidate immediately. Like, it would have been out. If this was a decade ago, game over, done, right? Not now. So my point is, I think we're reaching a level of low where there's not a floor anymore in terms of our politics. And that concerns me. I'd love to know what others think about it, but Justin Fairfax was run out on allegations that he had, I will say, sex that was at first consensual and then it was awkward or whatever the lady said. And he was condemned from the vice president all the way down, Democrats to get out. Jay Jones texts are horrific. You can't justify that. And they haven't done it. So I think it's a new landscape.
Well, I think a little bit on that is like at this point, maybe something that's held some of the Democrats back from saying that he should actually basically step out is like, what do they do on a ballot to replace him, right? Because so many votes have been cast early. I think it's almost 400,000 at this point. And so like, what do the kind of county election offices do to handle that? I think maybe something good that he could kind of do is say, okay, well, if I win, I won't take office. I'll allow Spanberger or whoever to kind of replace me. We'll have a special election next year, so something like that.
I do think there's probably a level of, and I think Trump is a great example of this and probably the best example of this, but there's this sort of level of, I call it sort of shamelessness in politics. I really remember thinking about that during the Ralph Northam thing here in Virginia, in that, I think in a previous era before Trump, Northam might have resigned, and also the fact that, he couldn't, Justin Fairfax had problems too, and so that maybe prevented Northam from resigning. But Northam was able to finish his time in office. He wasn't able to hand off the governorship to a Democrat, but but he was able to salvage that. And I think that word shameless. I think it kind of animates a lot of what's going on in
No, I
politics right
do
now.
think that era where, whether it's McGreevey or somebody else, where you're standing at the podium and your spouse looks sad and you resign. And same thing, I guess Al Franken was probably one of the last ones to go, but my guess is if Al Franken could do it again, as long as you can still gut it, there's a chance you can stay, and there's not a lot in politics these days where they give you any points for humility, and as you say, shamelessness. A lot of people are able to survive it and serve and continue.
And at a certain point, it's just a decision of the person. Like John Reed, the Republican candidate for lieutenant governor, Governor Youngkin asked him to leave the race back in, I think it was late April, over this Tumblr account, it's sexually explicit stuff. And Reed said no, just like Jones, I think, would say no. Now,
More
at that
has
time,
come out.
Reed could have, the primary hadn't happened yet, although he was unopposed, but Reed could have been replaced. It seems like Jones really can't be replaced right now. Olivia, I want to ask you about, your time covering Congress. We've sort of been talking about this sort of like breakdown or whatever. Do you think that that's the case? Like, if things are things getting worse, basically? I guess that you could sort of talk about it in terms of the shutdown, but also just the, relations between the members and that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, I started reporting in 2016, and everyone started talking about what politics used to be. That was when Trump came on the scene, and it just started having a different tone. But you would still see Democrats and Republicans being friends. There are workout groups, and that's how they become friends, and they do bipartisan legislation. But you don't see them touting it, because their voters are not going to reward them unless they are very centrist and doing these bipartisan things. They're not going to reward them from having friends across the aisle. But I feel like the tone shifted after January 6th, where it seemed extremely bitter. You were not seeing the bipartisanship, and some of that's been a little bit restored, but you have just a different makeup. You have people, I think, who are way more, willing to throw bombs, like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert. That doesn't mean they don't have Democratic friends, but they will never be posting on them. But the nature has definitely changed, and I tend to think some of the change is just because you have 24-hour news, you have social media, you have these blogs, and there's no strong incentive for the right to come to the center or to become friends with the left, and vice versa. And there's more and more talk of villainizing. Like, if you are on one side, you're going to villainize the other. It's they're against you, we're going to fight for you, they're going to come take your rights, whatever. And I think you're seeing that more and more. That doesn't mean that there aren't still buddies on either side, but the House has definitely started to change a little bit from when I first started covering it in late 2017 to the present day.
Let me move on to a little bit of a 2026 midterm conversation. I want to kind of look at both parties. John alluded to the fact that Democratic Party favorability is really pretty lousy right now, and that's pretty consistent across the polls. In terms of the election results, and obviously we're going to see what happens in November, but there's special elections. There was a Supreme Court election in Wisconsin. There's been a handful of other things. It feels a lot like 2017 did. When Democrats did well that year and also did well in the midterm. But the Democrats' favorability is worse. Things like the House generic ballot polling, Democrats lead, but maybe not by as much as they did in 2017. John, I guess I'll start with you, and others can address this. Like, is it kind of like 2017 and 2018, or is it more complicated than that?
I think times are more complicated. The other part of it is, I mean, we've never really seen a president go in and demand that states be basically ripped apart and reset. And so he's building this giant red wall, this safety net that we've never seen before. So, in 2006, we took 30 seats back. One, there aren't that many competitive seats the way they once were, and the country, as you say, is so much more polarized. So one, he's building a heck of a safety net. I do think in terms of his favorability, I worry less about, or it's really not about the Democrats' favorability. We're not the ones in power. So in 2006, by the way, we didn't have super great favorability. We're not the ones screwing stuff up. We're not the ones who promised that we'd lower prices and then we didn't. And then just generally, if you think about what's happened in the 28 midterms, there is this fatiguing of constant chaos. Obviously, Trump, phenomenal chaos the way he wins elections, but there is a fatigue as to what he's doing, and at the same time, they see prices aren't going down, wages are stagnating. So you know what? At least the Democrats aren't doing this. Let's give them a shot. We don't love them, so I like where we are, but it's going to be a lot of hard work. I think the way we win it are very tough spots, kind of like we did in '06 when we won by winning places like Indiana. If you look at where we can win, it's going to be like Christina Bohannon in Iowa. It's going to be Bridget Brink in Michigan. It's going to be places like that, knowing we have to overcome the gerrymandering on top of already what's a tough map. So I like our chances, but it's going to be tough.
And kind of basically on that, in 2018, there were something like a few dozen Republicans who had seats that had gone for Clinton in '16. I mean, this time it's only a few, huh?
Yeah, now Democrats are starting from a higher floor at 215. I think they had 194 in 2016. But there are this redistricting going on in certain places. There are also, just as an FYI to the audience, there may be a very important U.S. Supreme Court decision coming later this year, maybe next year, about the Voting Rights Act and Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act specifically, that essentially effectively mandates the creation of and then protects majority-minority districts. And the court has maybe signaled that maybe they don't want to have those kinds of districts anymore. They don't want to have, I think what maybe conservatives might say is kind of almost like racial gerrymandering, but the result of that could be that Republicans get a lot more seats in some of those states. Mark, I think you wanted to. Oh, sorry.
I think that the Democrats are so lost and so leaderless, it might save Republicans, but I don't think so. I think typically midterm cycles are about the party that's in power, and it's a referendum on them. And so I think, again, that, as we've said, Republicans have a hard time getting the same turnout if Trump's not on the ballot. I think that these cycles are going to favor Democrats significantly. And I think that there's actually a much bigger downside risk for Republicans in the midterms. And that is because I think that Trump was elected principally to secure the border and to fix the economy. And a lot of Americans were tired of runaway inflation. It felt like he would solve that. I think that regardless of how you feel how he's doing it, largely a lot of Americans believe he has done the border. But I really, really worry about the trade agenda. I think that what the president has adopted is a wholesale, massive tariffs across the globe that's not targeted like the first administration was on China. And I think that the last time we've seen tariffs this high was 100 years ago during Smoot-Hawley. And I think that right now you've seen markets continue to hit all-time highs, whether that's because of AI or because expectations the Fed's going to lower rates. But you also can see more and more softening and weakening in the labor markets. And I think that's going to really, really could be a huge downside for Republicans that they're not waking up to because they're getting, enamored with where markets are going. And the president is somebody who always is a maximalist. And he feels like, look, I'm going to push this trade agenda until somebody stops me. And right now, there's no stopping. There's no stopping in Congress. There's been little stopping in the courts. And as long as markets are hitting all-time highs, he's going to keep doing it. And I think when you're actually going to see the impact on prices being higher from tariffs and jobs continue to come down is going to be next year. And it's going to be a lot harder for Republicans to change course in 2026. And so I think the Democrats are in a terrible position. I think they have no leadership like 2017. Speaker Pelosi, whether you liked her or didn't like her, she was a strong leader. And Democrats don't have that today. But it's going to be a referendum on Republicans. And if the economy goes south, I think it could be a much bigger year for Democrats.
I agree with that, and I don't think you need a national Democratic leader. I don't think one is wanted or would be respected. I don't think you're going to see a Newt Gingrich of the Democratic Party march down the Capitol steps with a contract with America. I don't think we're in that moment anymore where people would believe that stuff. I think you're going to see these candidates and these districts and these states, one district by district, state by state. I think there will be a boost and an implied referendum on Trump. And I do think a great point on the tariffs is these Trump tariffs are a tax on American families, and they're feeling it. And the problem is, much like when Biden was trying to sell Build Back Better and all that stuff, and nobody was buying it, they will not stop selling these tariffs that are honestly every day go in the grocery store, and they're affecting you. Clothes, baby bottles, all of it, cars. It's a negative ad against the Republicans in the same way it was a negative ad against Biden back in the time, and they've got all the levers of power. And that's why, as weak as Democrats are as a label, there's a strength there for heading into the midterms. I agree with you.
I did want to go on when you're talking about the unfavorability. I think Democrats could get into a dangerous position if they start thinking, oh, the economy isn't going well, maybe that will help us, or Republicans, some of the points that Mark was making. There were enough warning signs for Democrats in the election where they lost ground with young voters, non-white voters, a whole bunch of key demographics that they need to figure out what they stand for. And the DNC, there was a report today, just put out an assessment that they found they were spending late, that they weren't paying attention to top issues that voters cared about, and the change up of the candidates mid-race didn't help. So I think Democrats still need to be really careful about looking at, because you do not know what the economy is going to be, and if healthcare starts also becoming an issue, there's going to be a lot of different factors at play.
So
I
to
go back-
Lydia's point, I think the redistricting is going to be a wash, basically, because I think California is going to redistrict theirs, and it's going to offset Texas. But to Lydia's point, much of the seats the Republicans are going to win in Texas is based on a belief of what the Hispanic vote was for Trump in 2024, when Hispanics did shift a lot for Trump. That's a one election cycle. And I'm not confident that you're going to see all of a sudden Republicans pick up 5 seats in Texas because of that redistricting, because I think it's banking on the notion that those Hispanic numbers stay the same.
So I'll go back to where I began, which is I feel like we're still operating in it's 1990 or it's 2004. It's not. And I think the culture wars is something we haven't talked about. ICE is going to play a huge role, in my opinion, on what happens in the midterms, how this stuff goes in Portland or in Chicago. And you have to understand that people who can't afford a cup of coffee, or they're struggling to make ends meet, they're furloughed, whatever, there is such a visceral dislike on this immigrant issue and the border and these issues that I believe there's a large swath of voters, and I think 2024 election proved it, that it doesn't matter what antics Trump has or what he does, they don't care. What they care about is they think he's stopping those people from coming in and taking their jobs, even if it's imaginary and it's not real. This whole ICE enforcement thing, it's big, and there are a lot of people in this country who are like, rah, 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 go. So I'm just not sure that the same things that we're used to having affect our politics really, they apply anymore, because I think we're in a different place. I could be wrong, but it's what I see in here.
You know, sometimes if I try to sound like an academic, and I want to use a big word, one word that comes up in midterms in particular is this word thermostatic public opinion. What does that mean? It means that basically the public reacts negatively to the party in power on things. And so there's a long history going back, I think, basically for the history of polling, I think at least to like the Eisenhower years in the 50s, where, you know, the president is conservative, the public all of a sudden starts to be a little bit more liberal. And then, you know, you get a liberal president, the public starts to be more conservative. And to your point about immigration, it's like, I think the president, you know, when the president is asked about his favorability on border security, it's usually very strong. It's certainly stronger than his overall approval. And immigration usually is too, but it's a little bit more mixed, I think in part because you're talking about, in that maybe there's this sense that if there was a negative reaction against Biden on immigration, it was that he was too soft. And now maybe it's going the other way, that maybe he's being too hard on it. I don't know if anyone wants to weigh in on immigration as an issue.
Well, now that I'm a scholar, I don't know that I can answer the terminology, but I think it's a good point. I think that a lot of Americans don't necessarily need to love Trump's enforcement. they just hated the open borders of Biden-Harris administration. And so I'm not necessarily where you are, Sophia, is that this is like rah-rah on the ICE, enforcement. I think that a lot of Americans are more nuanced, that they want to have a system where people can come to this country and succeed. It's what America's been built on. But they don't want to see the lawlessness that existed under Biden-Harris. That doesn't mean they also want to see raids on private sector companies. And so I'm not so sure that it's as big of a plus for the Trump administration right now, just because I think it was more of a reaction to how bad it was under Biden and Harris.
To Mark's point, though, those Latinos that voted for Trump in 2024, they ain't voting for him the next time. And what I mean by that, I think he's going to try to run in 28. That's another conversation for another day. But 26, I think you're going to see that Latino vote swing all the way back because, yeah, I think you will. I think they kind of learned a hard lesson on this one. I mean, and I see this through the lens as a person of color, as a woman of color, who I see it very differently and hear it very differently in my community and other communities of color. The perception of Trump and the Republicans is bad. It's really bad. So take that for what it's worth.
Just kind of more broadly speaking, and this is, again, I think about 2017, Trump's approval rating is better than it was in 2017, but I also wouldn't necessarily say that it's strong. Republicans, I feel like, are more tied to him than ever. I mean, there's even talk about doing a convention next year for the midterm, like hyper nationalizing the election. And, there's this idea maybe that, hey, if you're, even if Trump is maybe unpopular, that you want to stand with him strong and that you don't want to, contribute to his own unpopularity. But I don't know if anyone has thoughts about, how Republicans are dealing with Trump, how the public views Trump, and maybe also compared to 2017, 2018.
I mean, I think they're trapped and they don't have a choice. I think if they say even just mild critiques of Trump, they get Don Bacon, where they basically either quit on their own or they get forced out. I mean, there's the mild critics that are left are like David Valadao. They are not allowed to say something critical. You are not going to see an ad that you would occasionally see from Democrats who disagree with their Democratic president or disagree with their speaker or their minority leader. Democrats are kind of the party of NPR that politely will allow for disagreement. Honestly, without getting hyperbolic about it, the guy really is a dictator of his own party and doesn't put up with anybody who isn't in line with dear leader. And it's what's my latest gift? What's my latest compliment? How does this go? So you look at a person like Tom Barrett in Michigan, he is going to just have to play the game and hope that it plays out, because if he has one bit of protest, he's gone.
There's a new strategy. The new strategy is to back channel. It's not to be public. It's not to be critical where their words can be written in the press. I've covered Republicans for a long time. I specifically started covering them. It was assigned to them after January 6th. And I remembered watching this party that was so strongly believed that Donald Trump would not be coming back. And that's why you saw them all watching the wind and saying, he's done, he's never coming back to politics. But politics has a beautiful way of making people eat their words. And some of those people who said they did not want him coming back then started saying, I want him to run again. And you're just watching this party change. So now the strategy is not to get caught criticizing him and go to the White House, go to Susie Wiles as chief of staff, and try to say, hey, this is hurting your supporters back in my district. You might want to reconsider this policy. It doesn't always work because there's a lot of different people trying to get into the president's ear and have the final say. But in terms of just your broader question of Congress, Mike Johnson has asked repeatedly about whether he is handing over his power to the White House, and he will always deny it and say, no, we're an independent branch of government. But more and more, it's not just this Congress, and it's not just under President Trump. Congress has, over the years, been giving the executive branch more and more power, but you now have a Republican Party that is afraid to criticize their leader, so they're staying quiet, especially when the tariffs are starting to really hurt them back home. They're staying quiet when Russ Vought of the OMB starts reaching in and in their mind, getting involved in their appropriations process, which is their power of the purse, their big thing to do. So there definitely is this undercurrent of Republicans giving away their power in DC.
Yeah, and to your point, like, if you were Marionette Miller Meeks or you were Congressman Nunn in the Des Moines-based district in Iowa, and you have farmers in your district who are getting just absolutely creamed by these tariffs, it's not even just that you would want to disagree behind the scenes. You would want to say it out loud to your farmers, I'm with you, I know these tariffs are hurting you, and that's why I'm opposed to them, and they're wrong. But instead, they have to actually voice support for these tariffs that are hurting Iowa farmers. And that's what's so amazing this time, and why it's so different, is that they have to actually like say it out loud and sing off the sheet.
Yeah, I think in 2017, 2018, President Trump was still trying to unify the party behind him in a lot of ways. Today, he owns the party, and he is, whether you like it or don't like it, he has flexed his muscle inside the party in being willing to primary people in his own party. That never used to happen. The Republicans or Democrat presidents would say, look, this guy might be against me, but I'm not going to take him out because I need his vote at the end of the day. And Trump has turned that entirely upside down in a way to exert power over Congress. But I think that at the end of the day, you would want to have a vote that, even if it's unsuccessful, were to say, look, I voted against the notion that you could have IEEPA as a position to tariff everything across every product and every single country across the globe. I think it would help you in a general election to be able to say, look, I stand with Trump on a lot of these things, but here are the votes when I distance myself. And if there's none of that, I think it's going to hurt in some of the battleground seats.
And it shows, honestly, the fact that Thomas Massie is like a profile in courage just speaks to how strange the times are. And I also do wonder, I never thought I'd be talking about the Epstein files, but like, what the hell are in those things? Like, why can't we see them, and why are Republicans standing by it? It's the weirdest thing. There must be something incredibly horrible in it.
But sure, when Democrats were in control of the DOJ, Epstein had already been convicted. They could have released the files. I mean, yeah, I think the files should be released too, but come on. The Democrats controlled the Department of Justice. They controlled the White House. If they wanted to release them, they could have when they were in control.
But it's like, knowing what we know now, why not release them? Like, as a party that is like weaponizing the government, let's see them. You know what's in
Could we talk about the state of our democracy, maybe, just a little?
Go right ahead.
Is it just me? Is anybody else worried?
Sure.
Semi-sesquicentennial next year.
Well,
Wait a minute.
Oh, sorry.
I'm serious. Is anybody else, are we paying attention? This is not normal for the President of the United States to do the things we're talking about, to threaten people and openly DM the Attorney General. He thought he was DMing it, but he openly put it on True Social. Why aren't you going after James Comey? And then the man gets indicted. We don't do that in this country. And it seems like we're getting more and more comfortable with, well, it's just the way it is. It's just Trump. Okay. I mean, is it just me, or I want to hear from other people, but I am concerned, alarmed, upset, angry, disgusted, every word you can come up with, because this is not normal what we're doing here. And we're allowing it to, that performance by the Attorney General yesterday before the Senate, they were doing oversight. They have a constitutional duty to do oversight. The Attorney General doesn't have a Oppo research file and attack every senator who asks. That's disgusting. That's not what we do here in this country, and I'm worried. So I'd love to hear from others, but.
The point I was going to make, just in kind of piggybacking off of what John and Mark said, was just there's like the incredibly shrinking Congress. Is that I think in sort of past generations, you might have expected even leaders of the same party as the president to sort of assert the power of Congress in certain ways, and there are instances of that throughout history. But it's really not happening. And so that you think about like the growing power of the executive, and Trump is obviously not shy at all about exerting those powers. Anyone else have any thoughts about just where we're at right now in terms of the state of the government?
Well, I think Olivia made this point before, and I think this has been a trajectory that we've been on for quite some time. I think it's on steroids at the moment, but I was working as a staffer in Congress when President Obama said, I recognize that we can't just legalize immigrants under DACA, it has to be legislated. And then he decided to do it with a pen. I remember when Joe Biden said, we can't just forgive student loans, it has to be legislated. And then he just did it from the executive office. And so you've been seeing Congress cede its power to the executive branch for a long time. And I think Trump sees that opening and he's expanding it grossly. But you also have, frankly, incredibly timid and coward people serving us in the Congress today who are unwilling to actually take a stand. And so this has been happening for many years, and we're sort of reaching a much more maximalist approach today, where you do have nobody in Congress because, frankly, what we have, as we touched on this earlier, is that what we have incented for our elected officials today is basically to become performance artists. It's not to be serious legislators. It's how many YouTube, hits can I get? How many likes can I get on social media? And so we've created an incentive structure where you're actually having people who, as I say, are performance artists. And that's not going to change until the American people decide they want to change it. Until the American people say, I want to have more serious legislators in Congress.
Let me go back to the electoral sphere here. So in the Senate, we talked about the House a little bit. Obviously, redistricting is sort of scrambling things. I think you'd say, based on history, Democrats probably should win the House next year, and then we'll see what the map looks like. Does anyone think the Democrats could win the Senate back next year? Miles, maybe you could talk briefly about the situation. Others can chime in.
Yeah, so basically with 1/3 of the chamber being up every 2 years, it's not like the House where just everything's up. I think this year, basically, one of the big themes we've seen in Senate races is just that people don't split their ticket much. Why that's important this year is even though the Republicans hold something like 2/3 of the 33 seats that are going to be up, most of those seats are in pretty safe Trump states. So really the two big races I would watch next year, at least from the perspective of the Democrats trying to go on offense, you have Maine, which is Senator Susan Collins.
I think
She's been there a while. She has looked vulnerable in the past, but she always finds a way to get her crossover. That is the only state that Kamala Harris won, but has a Republican. And then the other one I'd watch is North Carolina. That's a state in federal level politics that tends to lean Republican. In state elections, usually a bit more Democratic. But the Democrats think that they have a great candidate in former Governor Roy Cooper. In fact, just before we came on, I got a fundraising text from him. So yeah, he just raised like 14 million or something.
We always need more.
Oh yes, yeah, always.
And that's an expensive state, too.
Yeah, and it's
TV market.
so they think that this could be the year that they finally win North Carolina at the kind of federal level. But the flip side of that as well is the Democrats are going to have to defend a few of their own seats. I think we have them both as toss-up, but basically...
Georgia and Michigan, yeah.
Yes, but I would say Michigan might be a little more vulnerable because the Democrats have this multi-way primary. In Georgia, I personally think Jon Ossoff looks pretty good. So we'll see if we can move that race off a toss-up. But so yeah, it is.
Seat. What do you think about the open?
Yeah, so that's one race. I think Iowa is one of those states where sometimes we talk about how some states have kind of basically changed politically. I remember in the Obama times, Iowa was like a purple state. Now it's more like a red state. But I think that might be one race where Senator Joni Ernst, who's retiring now, I think the Republicans probably would have been worse off if she ran.
I agree
because
with that.
But it's one we have as likely Republican.
Yeah, the tricky thing for Democrats is that, even if they win all these competitive races we're talking about, setting Iowa aside, they would still have to win 2 additional seats in states that Trump won by double digits. to win the Senate. And so that's why we sort of have the Republicans favored in the Senate. But I struggle with the path. I don't know if anyone has any other thoughts on that.
I think it's likely that Republicans hold, but to your question, is it possible? Of course it's possible Democrats take it. I think, you go through the states and Republicans have not had a good cycle recruiting the candidates they wanted. We didn't get Brian Kemp in Georgia, and I think that's why you have Ossoff as a strong favorite. North Carolina, Tillis stepped aside. I think probably you'd have to suggest that Cooper's the favorite in North Carolina. The Democrats got Sherrod Brown back in Ohio. And typically when you've been defeated, it's really hard to come back. Like, voters have made their decision, but he's running against a person who was appointed to fill out a term. So I think that's a very competitive race. And I think, again, if the trade agenda is what I fear it could be, I think you could see a surprise in one of the farm states. And then we haven't even talked about Texas. But if you just saw Hunt got into the race, and that only helps Paxton. And if Paxton becomes the nominee in Texas, then all of a sudden you say it's impossible in one of these states there's a double-digit win for Trump. I think if Paxton's the nominee, then Texas is in play. And so, do I think that's all likely that Democrats run the table? No. But is it possible? Sure.
Yeah, I'm happy he mentioned the farm bill, because other than some of those more obvious states, in 2024, the Republican incumbent who came closest to losing was one of the senators from Nebraska. Her name was Deb Fischer. The guy who ran against her was not a Democrat. He was an independent.
He's running again.
Osborne, who's running in again. The Republican in the other seat is a little better than Fisher, but that's one that we have as likely Republicans, so could potentially get a little more interest in, I guess.
I'm going to go to our audience for some questions here as we finish up. But I did want to just talk real quick about look really ahead here to 2028. We talked about how the Democrats don't really have a leader. I think Gavin Newsom has maybe made some noise for himself just because of his redistricting stuff. But I mean, is there any front runner on the Democratic side to be the next leader of the party?
There really isn't, but there rarely is. I mean, Obama was exciting, but also came out of nowhere. Bill Clinton was exciting, but also came out of nowhere. So I think now is the time to see a lot of horrible slide decks about some magic words that are going to dig the Democrats out of the stuff. I think you're going to see a lot of preening by a lot of candidates around the country, stumping for other folks. But I think the one thing that we're going to find is different than a lot of times, not that there aren't going to be hardcore progressive candidates, and you see some of the things that are happening in New York City and other places that Bernie is stomping all over the country. I think it's going to be less about who's the most progressive and bold progressive, and more who is the strongest and who is a truth teller and who is tough enough to take on the Republicans. So different than the kind of kinder, gentler, what's the most progressive agenda is who is tough enough to really stick it to them and take this country back. That's the candidate I think is going to catch fire, and we won't know that for a very long time.
I had a question on the Senate. I meant to bring this up. What do you think about Beshear running in Kentucky? Is there any chance of that?
He has said he's not going to. This is Governor Andy Beshear in Kentucky. He was a
Senate.
very, very, very popular two-term governor who's term limited. And the challenge is that even though Beshear has won at the state level a couple of times, in a red state, a state that voted for Trump by 30 points in a federal race, it'd just be really challenging.
He looks like he's gearing up to run for possibly the presidency.
Yeah,
He's doing the podcast thing, which they all seem to be doing the podcast.
I
and
thought
trying
Harris
to
should
figure
have
out
picked
which
him.
message
That was who I
works.
wanted her to
Probably
run.
easier than writing a book, I guess. I don't know.
It's a new thing.
But yeah,
MIT.
Beshear actually is an interesting person to think about as a presidential candidate. I'm sure Democrats would love for him to run in Kentucky. We've also got. We talked about Maine and Susan Collins, Janet Mills, who's the governor of Maine. She's thinking about getting in, but there's already some kind of more kind of non-traditional candidates in that race. There's this oyster farmer named Graham Plattner who's gotten a lot of attention. It would actually be just interesting to see if there actually was a primary between the two of them, because Mills, as the sitting governor, she's like right out of central casting in terms of the kind of candidate Democrats nominate. But then you've got this kind of outsider person, and do some of the things we're talking about mean that maybe Democrats aren't going to pick the quote-unquote establishment person in these primaries, and maybe looking ahead to 2028?
Mills is 70, like, six.
She's older than Collins by I think several years, actually. Even though Collins has been in the Senate, I think since
I hope we do a
1996.
whole panel one day on that issue.
on older politicians.
Yeah, like, when is enough enough? When do you go home? When do you quit?
I mean,
Just saying.
some judges have mandatory retirement ages.
They ought to
but,
go, too.
But elected officials do not. Any other thoughts on the Democrats in 2028? On the Republican
Anybody
side.
think Harris comes back? I'm curious. Thoughts on Harris?
I mean, I thought it was interesting that she's not running for governor
I
of
did too.
California. I think had she run, I think that would have basically taken her out of contention for 2028, but I think now it's a bit more of an open question.
Her book is causing a lot of waves. So anybody thoughts on that, Harris?
Was she? And she also, I think the Democrats are getting sick of like this 2024 like navel gazing, like having to think about the past, and that has now been brought back up again because of the book and all that.
I think there's statistics, and I might be getting this wrong, but like I don't think Democrats, if they run for office again, the party tends to rebuke them, whereas Republicans have a higher chance if they run a second time of getting elected.
Yeah, there was this longstanding kind of like historical trend on the Republican side that it was like the person who lost would then come back and win. So like Reagan in '76 lost to Ford, and then he came back in '80, and then Bush won, lost to Reagan in '80, came back in '88. Bob Dole had lost the nomination in the past, then he won it in '96. But Romney's another good example. And to your point, maybe less so on the Democratic side. I guess you could look at Hillary Clinton as someone who lost in '08 and won in 2016. But Biden had run in the past and lost before. But then some of the other nominees from the '80s and '90s maybe don't fit into that.
Can I just say I hope the Democrats would nominate Kamala again? I think that'd be great.
Yeah.
I'll jump in. So on Harris, one, I thought anybody being able to run and do that in 100+ days, I did a phenomenal job with what she had. I think it's a mix of being dealt a bad hand with being too much change for some, which is unfortunate in this country, and then not enough change being saddled with the whole Biden record kind of rocking a hard place. But I think the toughest thing for her, thinking about 2024, is like I've got these candidates who want to run on their great record of managing COVID, whether it's as a governor or a mayor or whatever. I'm like, let me tell you something. No matter how great a job you did, no one wants to think about 2020. Like that was like the worst time anybody ever had. I think the same thing for Democrats in 2024. There's such an anger, rightly or wrongly, that you lost to Trump, the same way they hold it against Hillary, that you lost to Trump. We can't forgive you for that sin. We need to turn the page. To me, is there's such, not that she won't, I think out of the gate, she probably has a plurality lead perhaps, but I think it's thin and you're just waiting for someone to grab it and go and look forward because of losing to Trump.
Doesn't seem like she would necessarily crowd out others from running.
No.
You probably
Best thing that happened to her was the campaign was only 100 days.
I think that's right.
When she started, she actually was ahead.
Yeah.
And as people got to know her, she kept going further and further down.
And I whatever one thinks of her campaign, I mean, I think that when Biden was sort of doing his, final days in office, he was talking about how, maybe he would have won and whatever. And like, not only would he have lost, I think, but the Republicans might have 56 or 57 seats in the Senate right now. So I think that Harris's legacy to me is that she saved the Democrats from probably even a bigger defeat.
She did. I think different than the premise of her book, I think she did benefit from a shorter campaign. I thought that was her best shot, is to have a shorter one as opposed to a longer one. And I think her being the nominee instead of Biden did save a lot of people, Democrats, from just getting absolutely shellacked in the House and
I like to pick up on something Mark said. Kamala's my sorority sister, so I have to ask. So you said the more people got to know her, the less they liked her, and she went down. So what the hell's wrong with Trump then? What is that? Help me with that. So you mean the more people get to know that, they like it?
Well, maybe people don't dislike it as much as you think they do.
Wow, that's a scary thought.
He's been elected twice. You know,
Mark, you of all people should know that guy, he's something else.
He did his best in his third election. I mean, the numbers are what they are.
I'm just making a point
yeah.
that we forget that she was a she, and Hillary was a she. And Japan just elected a female, and everybody in the industrialized, advanced world has had a woman. Britain, 3 female prime ministers. We can't get a woman elected, so maybe it's a woman problem. Maybe that's the problem. Just saying. Anyway.
Real quick, what do we think about Republicans? I mean, I guess Trump always talk. I mean, he's handing out Trump 2028 hats. I guess he wanted Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer to take them when he was at the White House the other day. I mean, polling points to Vance pretty overwhelmingly. Any thoughts on 2028 for the Republicans?
My experience is he doesn't really set his vice presidents up for success.
That was precious.
I don't think it's going to be J.D. Vance. I think that,
I think it's going to be Trump.
to something you said earlier, John, I remember I was on the campaign in 2016, and I think that Donald Trump brought in a new voter to Republicans, a blue-collar, middle America voter that we had not had before. But I remember, I'm going to oversimplify this, so forgive me, but I remember in the fall of 2020, I read a New York Times story, and I'm confessing y'all actually read a New York Times story. And the reporter went up to Wisconsin and interviewed a handful of people who had been traditionally Democrat or independent who had supported Trump over Hillary. And again, I'm oversimplifying, but it was like, did you get what you wanted? It's like, yeah, I was a dairy farmer, and I got a better deal on USMCA. I was getting screwed before. I wanted a tax cut. I got a tax cut. I wanted the courts, and he got his picks through the courts. I wanted stronger national security. Are you voting for him again? No, I'm exhausted. And I think that, I do think that 4 years of Biden provide an alternative for Trump to come back, but I do think just the chaos of the presidency every day does exhaust the American people. And I think it's going to be hard for them to win in 28. Of course, that depends on what the Democrats put forward. But I also think that Republicans are in this position right now where you're trying to find a lot of mini-me's. And I don't think there is. I don't think you can replicate Donald Trump. I think he's a unique phenomenon. And so when you see those who are trying to be, the same on social media and emulate that, I don't think it's authentic, and I don't think it works as well. And so I think that Republicans are going to have a hard time finding what that replacement is, and I don't think you're going to see Trump on the ticket in 28. But I'm just saying, I think that those who are trying to be the mini-me's are going to have a problem because it's not really authentic. And so I think that it's going to be a much bigger fight on the Republican side in 28. But I also think if you're trying to be the replication of him and America's tired of it, it's going to be harder for them to win.
Yeah, I think that's really astute, and I think Democrats are horrible at just picking Republican nominees and probably vice versa. They probably know the least. I do think the caveat to that is if Trump endorses Vance, I think it fundamentally clears the field and there's not a lot of room for a lot of oxygen. I am, for all the crazy stuff that is Vice President Vance, I'm incredibly impressed with his evolution from never Trumper to moderate to Trump everlasting. Like, I've never seen a parlor player like that guy. It's absolutely incredible. I mean, the only one like that in our party is Kirsten Sinema, who went from Code Pink, Green Party, Nader voter, Blue Dog to pseudo almost Republican. I mean, I've never seen such a journey.
I think that there might be a different discussion because I agree with Mark. When you see people trying to emulate Trump, it just doesn't fully work and it doesn't come off authentic. But I think we also need to grapple with the question of what do voters decide they want afterwards? Do they want to start going back to the center, or do they still want a fighter who's more populist and can trade on a more authentic image than some of the people who are just trying to replicate that? And I remember watching even the last presidential primary where you saw Ron DeSantis' name being so high up in the beginning, and he just really started torpedoing, but also Republicans just shifted on him after the Stormy Daniels lawsuit, where they started feeling like, oh, Trump is being misaligned, and they started seeing which way the winds were blowing. And for them, it's politically advantageous to be aligned with whoever wins in the White House. So you have that call to the Oval Office, and could be named to the cabinet, could get a Senate endorsement if you want to run for higher office. So I think that you just saw the political winds shift in terms of who people thought was the front runner. So there's always a danger of saying, well, this guy's up right now, but the race hasn't even really started, and you can't see them once they're in a broader field of other people. So I wouldn't just say it's going to be a coronation advance. And as Mark said, a lot of different things can happen before, we get to the end of the presidency.
Hey, Kyle, you think there's any chance that Glenn Youngkin challenges Mark Warner for the Senate seat in 26?
I think the ship has probably sailed on that, and I think it'd be a real heavy lift. Even though Youngkin remains, his approval rating is still positive in Virginia when we get these polls, even with Spanberger leading by 10, 12 points or whatever. I think the governor would like to run for president. That seems to be my sense of things. Among many other people, I think. Whether there's room for him or not is a different question, but I would think maybe that would be more of something he would want to do. Any questions from the audience? I would defer to the students first.
So typically the DSCC has had more success in choosing its Senate candidate it prefers compared to the RSCC, which has kind of lost Senate because the Republican primary voters have picked the candidate that maybe the RSCC didn't prefer. This cycle we're kind of seeing, like you talked about Graham Planter in Maine, but we're also seeing like Abu El-Said in Michigan. Was there anything to the fact that the DSCC is struggling more nowadays to kind of clear the field for candidates like Haley Stevens in Michigan and I think Janet Mills won in Maine? Is there anything to that, or is it just?
So there's a question about the two-party Senate committees, and typically to your point, the Republicans have had this spate of kind of poor Senate candidates, and most recently 2022 was a pretty bad slate, and Trump had a role in that. But Trump and Republicans actually made basically some pretty decent choices in 2024. There are a lot of candidates who I think fit the national Democratic mold, like Sherrod Brown running again, very much in that sort of mold. I think if Janet Mills were to run in Maine, she would fit that mold. Roy Cooper in North Carolina is another example of that. But I'm kind of curious, like, do any of them have a real legitimate primary if they run? Does Maine actually become a primary? Like, do you start to see some revolts in primaries? I guess you could maybe argue that Mamdani represented that in New York City, although it was complicated, and Andrew Cuomo had all sorts of problems, and it was a big field.
Right.
But that's just a big question for me for 2026. Any other thoughts about this?
The DSCC establishment record's a pretty great one. The last time I think a challenger beat the DSCC pick was actually John Tester winning in Montana. And then he ended up
in a primary.
Joining, that's what I'm talking about. That's what you're talking about, a primary.
Yeah.
Is John Tester actually ended up becoming the DSCC chair and kind of becoming part of the establishment. But Morrison, his opponent at the time, kind of melted down. But I have to say the DSCC record is pretty good, and this is a giant test. Michigan's a great test. I do think Maine will end up being a primary, and that'll be a great test. But so far, it's pretty unmatched. But I think Michigan's a great example. I think there's a really strong, great field where everybody's running. I think, I don't have a dog in that fight. We work for Jocelyn Benson in Michigan, and Bridget Brink, as I mentioned. But that, McMorrow and others, Haley Stevens is great too. It'll be interesting to see how that turns out. But I think at the end of the day, it's probably Stevens or McMorrow. But obviously, traditionally, it would be Stevens who is the kind of the establishment pick there.
Other questions?
Yes. Hi, Kyle, Olivia, Miles, Sophia, Mark, and John. Thank you so much.
Got everyone.
Yes. I've really enjoyed your commentary. Hi, I'm Sophia. I'm a fourth-year politics student and former intern for the center. I'm currently in a constitutional interpretation class, and the Supreme Court just started their term on Monday, and something that we discuss is the Supreme Court overturning historic landmark cases and the impact that may have in the future. One case is the Voting Rights Act of 1965 related to cases in Louisiana regarding historically congressional black districts. So my question is, with the Supreme Court, kind of challenging some really historic cases, what impact is that going to have on the midterms and this election?
Did Kyle put you up to that question? He was just talking about that before we started the panel.
Yeah, I think I mentioned this a little bit, but so there is this this just jurisprudence about majority minority districts. And actually, it's really complicated. And there have been all these legal fights over the years in which it's like you're kind of supposed to draw majority minority districts, but they shouldn't be like, squiggles across the map. I mean, they should be geographically compact. There's something called the Gingles test. Some call it the Jingles test. It's this sort of, I think it's a three-pronged sort of assessment as to whether you should create or could or should create a majority minority district. And so there have been all these legal battles about this over the years. And this court, obviously, they overturned what's probably the most famous Supreme Court decision of the last 100 years, Roe v. Wade. They didn't have any problem with overturning that and, removing federal protections for abortion rights and giving that to the states. So I don't think that they're particularly shy about going against kind of a longstanding precedent. And I mean, the fallout could be very significant. I mean, it could affect the House next year. I mean, if that decision comes down in time for states like Alabama, Louisiana, South Carolina, for instance, that they don't have to have the black majority districts they have now, well, that could be really politically advantageous for Republicans. So it's very important potentially. And that's on top of all the other redistricting conversation that we've had.
I think my pushback on that would be with the voting rights. It's a little more complicated when the court takes cases that deal with race, historically going all the way back, right? And so when you look at what I find ironic, the Republicans are the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, the purveyors of that, the guardians of protecting the rights of the former slaves going all the way through. And now you go through the Voting Rights Act through Reconstruction all the way to the 1960s, and you go to the Warren Court, of course, and this is the complete opposite. So I think the court has to do a little bit of a different test, if you will. When race is a factor, they always kind of balance that a little bit because of the historical context, but I don't think this court, I agree with you, that they're going to be shy about. I think that there's this new orthodoxy that's the woke and the anti-DEI stuff that they talk about. And I think that while conservatives are in, they are going to do a lot of upending of a lot of policies and things that when they were Dixiecrats, they didn't like. And we can talk about this more offline, but yeah, I think they're going to overturn it, actually. I do.
And just to add on to what Kyle said, even without the Voting Rights Act, even if Republicans have a free hand at a lot of these states, just because they can draw a map one way doesn't mean that they would or will. If I'm in Louisiana and I'm a Republican member of Congress, am I going to want to take in too much of Orleans Parish? I don't know. And then I guess another thing that might be worth noting is that we talked a little earlier about the map that they're trying to pass in California. The changes that they made to that map were made on political grounds, not on VRA grounds. So presumably, I guess, yes, if the VRA is tossed out, you would have more Republicans drawing maps in some states in the South. But I guess California could draw.
You could probably, if you didn't have the VRA, you could probably draw a 52-0 Democratic map in California, and they'd all just be these little squiggles. And in Illinois, instead of it being a current Democratic gerrymander, it's 14-3 Democratic. It could be 17-0, and like every Illinois House member would have a piece of Chicago. What I think is, I usually try to play this straight, but I'm going to make an editorial comment here. The problem with if you had the court simultaneously change Section 2 or change racial gerrymandering in such a way and de-emphasize it, but then you also had a situation where the Supreme Court tried to institute some basic fairness standards for redistricting, I actually don't know if the impact would be that much, but the impact of taking away VRA Section 2 without doing anything else means you're going to have probably just really extreme gerrymandering, even more so than what you have now, which I guess I would think would be unfortunate.
You have a lot less black districts.
Yeah,
you have
absolutely.
A lot less black caucus.
And also Democrats they'd have a problem with their coalition if they, again, tried to draw a 52-0 map in California. There might be a member from a majority Latino district or an Asian American district or black district that says, hey, we should preserve this district, even though the law doesn't necessarily say we have to preserve it anymore. So it's really complicated, but here's the upshot of it. Of all this redistricting talk, which I know people, their eyes can glaze over talking about it and all that, the end result of it could be that Democrats win the House popular vote by 5, 6, 7 points next year, but Republicans might still win the House if all of these dominoes fall in their favor, which again is pretty significant. And if that's happening in next November, the redistricting piece of it would be an explanation why. Again, just hypothetically. I got time for another question or two.
Hi, my name is Evan. Firstly, thank you all for being here. My question is also on the redistricting issue. What are the practical implications of this for constituents? But then also, how does this change the political calculus for strategists in the DNC or the RNC who are looking at more thinly drawn districts that kind of lean less in a Congress that's already really closely divided?
So,
No, please.
so unfortunately, I was beat, but I was very close to being the reporter who broke the Texas redistricting story. But that's sort of the life you live. At the time, Republicans were calling me and they were very scared because they thought that their districts that could be plus 15, plus 25 would be watered down, and they didn't know what those were going to look like in an effort to carve out 5 or so seats. And most of them seem to be okay about the seats. I think they're also staying quiet because if they go along with this, they're expecting that the White House will step in to prevent any other candidate from challenging them. So there is some sort of feeling of protection. But if you feel like you have a representative and all of a sudden there's pure partisan play involved, I think you're going to feel a little bit disenfranchised, right? There's going to be an element of that. There's a question of whether there's going to be retribution or whether there's going to be an attempt to prevent this going forward. And I can't seem to find the answer because no one wants to take that possibility off the table. If there's a Democratic president, would they choose to then do something like this as well? So with the Texas Democrats, a lot of them are hoping that the courts will overturn it. And in California, they're hoping that the voters will overturn it. And trying to get them to talk about it, it's almost like they are so hopeful that Plan A works that they don't have to talk about Plan B, which would be then they're having to primary their colleagues that they like, which means that they're then going to have more difficult races against Republicans, or they just don't have a seat to run it. But they all bring up long-term consequences, which is, yes, a Republican, if his seat is watered down, might win this election, but he or she could become vulnerable in the future. So I think that that's some of the consequences that these lawmakers are talking about. But at the moment, they're just in a state of hoping and praying.
And then in terms of like the long-term implications, I have to say, in terms of, this really is an unprecedented time, but when you have potentially state by state politicians picking their voters instead of voters picking their politicians, and you think about the partisan extremes that happen, when our country is best off when there are as many 50-50 districts as possible. That means you have to listen to people that you may not agree with. It makes you represent as well as lead. When all you are worried about is a primary, you completely forget about, if you're a politician who's self-serving, you completely forget about the people who don't agree with you, and you just go hard blue if you're a Democrat or hard red. And of course, in the middle are left the independent voters, and even whether it's like Republicans who feel completely disenfranchised, and you have a country that more and more feels that people aren't listening to them because they aren't. You have one party that listens to one side and one party that listens to the other. So I think this redistricting thing, which can get really boring really quick, is incredibly important, and what's happening is incredibly disturbing as to what happens next and how we think about our politics.
Yeah, like if you look at the races that right now, I think we have, 19 that are toss-ups or something like that. Just the goal of a lot of these maps is to create, as few competitive seats. And What was kind of refreshing this year is one of the states that looks like it's going to get a new map, possibly next year, is going to be out in Utah, and which is right now it's a Republican gerrymander. The kind of remedial plan that the Republicans put forward, they didn't want to concede a Democratic seat. So they drew two really competitive seats, and I'm like, wow, we have a mid-decade map that has more competition. Oh my God, it's.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's 18 or 19 toss-ups, but if you go down that list, almost all the toss-ups are in states that have some sort of redistricting commission, or they have like a court-drawn map, or there was some sort of like bipartisan compromise. And I mean, even if all the states had to draw the districts to maximize the number of competitive seats, you'd still have a lot of uncompetitive seats, because it's like a lot of places, you're not going to have a competitive district in western Kansas or western New York or New York City in a lot of places, or Los Angeles, but you could certainly have more competition than you have now. We have time for one more question.
Hi, my name's Celeste. Thank you so much for coming. I wanted to ask about the media, specifically in Washington.
Uh-oh.
A lot about shifts in politics, mainly like the division in Congress, especially in Congress. And something that I've noticed is a huge push for politicians to tell the public like not to trust the media. And we've seen this age of social media and like politicians themselves getting on social media and telling constituents what they want to tell them in the way that they want to tell to them. So how can the media compete with that and balance objectivity with also communicating like the extent to which what's happening in Washington is unusual?
I think one of the trends that you're seeing, for better or for worse, is a lot more background, like lawmakers who are not willing to put their name on it, which also means it's a lot harder. Readers don't typically trust just seeing a person as an anonymous House lawmaker and saying, why is that reporter letting them? I'm finding increasingly that is how they're comfortable talking about how they really feel. But it also gives them cover. There has been kind of cases of duplicity where you'll write a story of Republicans who are frustrated with Trump, and then those same people will say, I love Trump, these reporters are fake news on Twitter, and so they can have their cake and eat it too. I don't find that like access to Republicans or access to lawmakers is limited, and I have even seen like in 2018 you started seeing progressives doing it. Republicans traditionally, back to was it Newt Gingrich, started going after the press, and it was very kind of a popular strategy on the campaign trail. But I think there's just a lot of pressure to be right, because you have a lot of people who are willing to just call you fake news, but we're getting into a situation where you can just be writing something that's critical and people will now be saying you're fake news. So I think that for the people who are being held to account, it works in their favor to have less trust in the fourth estate. But there's also just a new approach that reporters have to kind of take to navigate it, because there's a lot more reporters up on Capitol Hill, which also means that if a Republican doesn't want to put his name on it, or a Democrat doesn't want to put her name on it, or whichever, then they'll just not talk to you. So figuring out which ways you can, as a reporter, like the things that we strive to now is seeing if we can get that quote where that person is actually owning up to it, and trying to work on those relationships. But there's definitely sort of that situation going on.
I think it all gets down to how you define media. Media is really a vast term now. Very different 30 years ago. You had to have your credentials, be a reporter from a major news outlet or an outlet that had access. Now anyone can be media. You can have your phone, your whatever, a TikTok account, and you call yourself a journalist. You could have a blog. Those people are actually now covering the White House. And so one of the things that President Trump has done is very different is, for better or worse, is he's allowed a lot of new media into the White House press corps. So you don't have Jim Acosta there anymore from CNN. You have Caitlin kind of stepping up in there from CNN. But
Or
you don't
comfortably smug, is that the name of the guy?
So, you know, it's one of those things where you have a whole different type of media now, which makes it a very different ballgame. And I think that there's a lot less trust from the public. Because, you know, like when I was growing up, and some of us, I don't want to age people, but like, you know, Tom Brokaw, Peter Jennings, Dan Rather, who had been around for a while even then, but those guys were like gods to a degree. They came on your news, they spoke, they were trusted, respected. They weren't seen as partisans. They were just seen as news guys. Like, am I wrong?
I certainly viewed them all as partisan. Celeste, I think the legacy media died because they were
That's where I
partisan.
was going.
They were partisan, and I think a lot of Americans got tired of it. I think it's one of the things that Trump ran against, they were successful with. I think that the destruction of the legacy media in a lot of ways is positive, because you get your news from a lot of different sources. I think there's a danger in it too. And I say this as somebody who, my oldest son graduated here in '24. I have another one in college, a daughter and senior in high school, and so I don't want to be preachy on this. But, you know, I was privy to the President's daily intelligence brief. And I know when the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States unanimously recommended, these are not partisan people, these are intelligence people, unanimously recommended against the requirement to require TikTok to sell to an American or to be banned, is because what the Chinese and the Russians do with their algorithms is not to try to choose winners and losers, they're just trying to create unrest. And so for a lot of you, the videos you get are intended to continue to sow unrest. And so when we talk about the environment today and saying, you know, it's dangerous and that there's just more political violence, I don't think we stop to appreciate how much foreign actors are actually being a part of that.
Agree.
And what the information you're getting on your phones is not that it's necessarily false, but it's always intended to create more and more distrust, more and more unrest. And so while I did not view Dan Rathers as unpartisan, I think he was entirely partisan.
Yeah, I just threw him
And I
out
think
there.
that a lot of legacy media was, and the destruction of that, I think, in some ways is positive, that you get your news a lot of different ways, but there's also dangers with it. And I think our foreign adversaries know that, and I think they're playing with it. I think a lot of information you guys get on your phones is not necessarily something that should just be assumed as truthful, because it's in many cases being intentionally used to reach exactly your age.
Yeah.
A round of applause for our panel. Thank you for your questions and for coming.
Yes.